Hi, welcome to the DC MuleSoft Meetup. Today we'll be talking about setting up a CI/CD pipeline with MuleSoft and Azure DevOps. My name is Catherine Wills. I'll be today's meetup speaker. A few facts about me. I currently live in New York City, but I'm originally from Georgia. I have coming up on about 2 years of MuleSoft experience. Some hobbies of mine. So I went to the University of Georgia, so I love watching the Georgia Bulldogs, as well as the Atlanta Braves. I'm a big nerd on history museums. I also like to ski and golf. So to start this off, we're going to combine CICD DevOps together and look at them together. So what is CICD? So CICD is the idea of constantly and frequently delivering your applications by automating those stages within the application development lifecycle so that you're able to continuously integrate and continuously deploy and deliver. So CI is continuous integration. So what that is you are constantly integrating into your main branch, which is then verified by an automated build and automated unit testing. For continuous delivery, that CD aspect, that means you're automating the release of the validated code to production. So within this, you are continuously integrating your code. Those automated stages happen, and then you are continuously delivering and deploying to your production. DevOps. DevOps is the idea of taking your software development and your operations team, and you're pushing them together so that you can collaborate as a team. It also, you have shared responsibility because everybody knows a certain aspect. It also gives it improves a lot of communication because that way your quality engineers are in speaking with your developers, and they're kind of on the same page of what's our game plan, where are we going, what's happening. And so all of that combined together helps aid in a more holistic style of the agile software development lifecycle. And so some advantages of both just CI/CD and DevOps together is what this does is it increases the speed and it gives rapid deliveries. And so you also have, it has greater efficiencies and it gives you a streamlined process. Because of that streamlined process and because everybody knows, what to expect when and where, it also ensures that reliability aspect. You have shorter development life cycles because you're continuously integrating and continuously deploying. It also decreases deployment failures and bugs because one thing is because as you are integrating, those automated unit tests take off and they can identify those bugs there. They also, because you are deploying smaller amounts of code, if you have a failure or a bug, you only have a little bit of code to look through rather than a whole giant chunk. It also enhances quality and security because you have that, again, that streamlined process that everyone is on the same page about. And it really improves your communication throughout your entire team and enhances that collaboration as well, delivering a faster innovation for all of those deliveries. So some common branching strategies for DevOps. One most notably known is the Git flow branching strategy. And that one uses the main, the develop, the release, hotfix, and feature branches. A lot of larger teams use this because it's easier to collaborate in parallel. It also supports multiple versions of your production code. This one specifically isn't necessarily the easiest to integrate with CI/CD pipelines, but it does, again, one most notable because you're able to work in parallel in collaboration with large teams. The GitHub flow branching strategy, which is the one we'll be using today, it utilizes the main and the feature branches in the diagram to your right here. And this is easy for smaller teams, and it's easily integratable for those CI/CD pipelines. For the trunk-based development, it is integrating into the main branch once a day. And the idea of that is it's always in a releasable state. This branching strategy is excellent for CI/CD pipelines. But the branching strategy we'll use today is the GitHub flow one, which you see to your right, using that main branch, feature pulled off, and then going back into it. So part of this CI/CD pipeline setup is I'm going to show you the different setup options and different setup differences between CloudHub 1.0, 2.0, and Runtime Fabric. So this one just highlights a little bit about each of the three. CloudHub is most notably known to many because that was just the only CloudHub we had. Now we have CloudHub 2.0, which is kind of awesome. Like it said, it's the 2.0, it's the updated version. And then we have Runtime Fabric. It is using that primary execution as the Kubernetes pod, and it also requires a Runtime Fabric agent to run. But in today's demo, we'll be doing CloudHub 2.0. But before I jump into that demo, I want to show a little bit about what Azure DevOps has to offer, what it can do, so that you're able to kind of follow along a little better within the demo, so you're understanding where each of these aspects are coming from. So some highlighted features, there are branch policies. There are tons of customizable variations. You also can set up Slack notifications for your build and your release statuses. In here, you'll notice that I've set an approver request. So me as the approver, I can approve or reject this release right here. And so we'll talk about that a little in the demo as well. And you can also, there are many viewable logs that you can see. So some components within Azure DevOps, we've got boards, and boards is like your Jira. It's where you can plan your backlog. It's where you can plan your sprints, and you can keep track of each of your teamwork's tasks. In Azure DevOps, you have your organization, then you have your project, and within that project is where you have this set of components. And so a certain project can have multiple repositories within that you can set. And so your Azure repos is your set of version control tools used to manage your code. So this is where your pull requests will be, your code reviews will happen here. And this is just where all of your commit history and all that good stuff. The pipelines aspect, that is going to support that CICD to test and build and deploy the code. And within that, there's some subsections of pipelines, that's your build pipeline. That's where you'll, where the automatic build for your pipelines will happen, as well as test and your code for your projects. And then you've got releases, and that's what that's going to do is it's going to hold versions sets of artifacts specified in the CICD pipeline. We'll talk about that in pipelines, where we'll publish artifacts to a certain container, and it'll pick it up in the releases. And then you also have libraries. So your library will consist of variable groups and secure files. Your variable groups are things like your values and your secrets, your runtime properties. And then your secure files are where you can store things such as your settings XML. So like I said, those branch policies. When a branch policy is set on a branch, it is protected. So you can set policies for a specific branch namespace, such as develop or the main branch, and it's going to apply for all those branches with that same namespace for all your repositories in that project. What it does is it's protecting that branch from having changes pushed to. If you look to your to the left here, there's many different branch policies that you can place in, such as required minimum number of reviewers. You can allow requesters to approve their own changes or not approve their own changes. You can check for comment resolution. So during a code review, you've got developers that want to comment on code. And so these are just the different branch policy options and variations that you can have to protect those branches. So the two things we'll talk about are the build pipelines and release pipelines. First, you're going to have the build pipeline. So there's two ways you can set that up. You can do that using the YAML syntax here, uses the Azure Pipelines YAML, or the classic build interface. Today we'll be using Figure A. We'll be using and configuring the Azure Pipelines YAML. With this, there's also tons of customizable triggers, conditions, and tasks. You can run your test coverage results here, and there are viewable logs as well. So here is a build pipeline log, and it's showing my immunit coverage report ready to go, and it's showing me I've got application coverage at 100%. So before that goes, and there are different build trigger variabilities, and so there's many different, but I just pulled out these three. We'll talk about the first one here. CI stands for continuous integration. And what that does is it's going to use the push branch, the target branch, to set off and begin to build. And so what one has to do is one has to specify the trigger of what you want it to be pushed to. And so that if it's pushed into, or if there's a completion of a PR, which results in a CI, it'll run. This can also be triggered through a manual run of the pipeline. The other one is the pull request. So the pull request uses the source branch as the one to build. And so back to those branch policies, you have to have what's called a build validation. And that build validation branch policy specifies what pipeline you want that repository to kick off of. And for the pull request trigger, it's going to trigger and begin when a pull request into for that that branch that you've got the policy on, when that PR is created and active, not upon a PR completion. A pull request completion is actually going to result in what we are going to see is called individual CI, which is the continuous integration here. There's also the scheduled option, so that you can hear it uses the cron syntax to specify when you want it to kick off, and it also you can include which branches you want. So with this, built-in functions and predefined variables can be used in expressions to specify various condition combinations for the pipelines, stages, jobs, or steps. And so predefined variables, we'll see that a lot. Azure, those are the ones that Azure DevOps already has as predefined within their what they call predefined variables that you can use. So in this example here, this is using the CI trigger. Here, I've got it started off by triggering. I only want the main branch to go, and if the main branch has been triggered, it will check on the condition. And the condition says if everything above has succeeded, and the build.source version message, so that's a predefined variable, if that starts with the words merged PR, the string merged PR, then it'll kick it off. And so as per default, when a pull request is completed, the message starts as merged PR, and then it will finish with your either pull request message or your commit message. And so that is an example here. It's going to run that main branch on the CI trigger when that commit message starts with merged PR. And like I said, the default is that it does for a PR completion. Another option here is the PR, the pull request trigger. And so for this one, what it says, the condition says, if everything's exceeded above, it's going to use that system.pullRequest.target branch as the predefined variable, and it's going to say, hey, if the target branch is the main branch, let's kick off. And so say you're doing a feature branch into the main branch, it's going to kick that off and build, and that's when it's going to build. It's actually going to build both the source branch, so it'll build the feature branch. All right, so release pipelines. We just talked about build pipelines, now release. So release pipelines, you do this in a classic style interface. Another good thing about this is, say you are deploying to production and you're an hour into troubleshooting and things aren't going by your validation policy. If things haven't resolved in an hour, you need to roll back. And so the nice thing about this is you can actually redeploy a previous release at the click of a button, because you can also retain a release. So what you could do is your last successful push and deployment to production, you can go through and retain that release, and so it keeps forever, and then you can redeploy that if you need to roll back. There are also various deployment trigger options here as well, and there are pre and post deployment condition options, and there are also viewable logs. So this is the same logs that we saw in the build pipelines as well, and you'll see these logs specified for each task, and we'll show that in a little bit. So for a release to be created, right, there's different trigger options. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to set your release trigger. And what this does is it's when do you want a release to be created? And so there's 3 different options. Continuous deployment. This is going to create a release after a successful what we call individual CI build. And that is and that could be a manual, or that could be a completion of a pull request. And so with that, you can also include or exclude branches. And we'll talk about that in the demo, because that's the one I'm going to use. You can also do a pull request one. It's going to create a release upon a PR creation after a successful build. You must set that build validation policy, and then you also set those target branch, and then you specify what stages. Now your stages are going to be your environments. And then again, there's also the scheduled option as well. After you set the release triggers, per stage, you have your pre and post deployment conditions. And so your stage, again, is your environments. So for your pre-deployment condition triggers, you can do it after the release is created, you can do it after a stage, or you can do it manually. You also have your deployment approval, so you can put certain names of who you want to approve that. And then you've got gates. So that gates are going to automatically collect health signals. So for example, there are some preset ones, such as invoke REST APIs. So say you could put that one as a post-deployment condition after it's deployed to production to invoke that API and see if it's healthy. All right, so to the demo. So a couple things before we get to the demo. I just want to talk about utilities. For example, Studio 7.14, but with the Apache Maven, I did want to point out that the latest Apache Maven version, 3.9 something, as of today, May 16th, 2023, is not compatible with the latest Mule Maven plugin version of 3.8. And so I'm actually using the Apache Maven version 3.8 in this demo because, like I said, it's not currently compatible with the latest Mule Maven plugin as of May 16th, 2023. Files I'll be using are the settings XML, the POM XML, as well as the Azure Pipelines YAML, the Mule Artifact JSON, but that's actually just for CloudHub 1.0, and I'll talk about that later. The environments I'm going to use for this demo are development, QA, and production. This is just what I'm using for today's demo. Your setup can be altered to in many different ways. So for example, if you've got a sandbox environment, a pre-production environment, a staging environment, what have you, all the the setup you have can be adjusted to your project's need. Today in my demo, I'm just doing development, QA, and production. So I'm going to go through what the pipeline pathway is. And the pipeline pathway is essentially saying, well, what's happening? Once this kicks off, what is the flow, the high-level flow? And so, like I said earlier, I'm using the GitHub flow branching strategy, which uses the main and the feature. So we have our feature branch created for the main branch here. We do our code, add our code, do our code, change our code. When we're done and we're in the development stage and we're ready just to deploy to dev to do some dev testing, we'll push those code changes to Azure. And then we'll manually trigger the pipeline for the feature branch. And this is so that, say you just want to commit and push, but you don't want it to automatically trigger that build. It has that built in so that you can do that without it automatically triggering a feature branch to go ahead and build in the pipeline. That way you can wait until you're ready, or if you're collaborating with other people and you just need to push into a feature branch for somebody to pull into or whatever. But once that is done and that's ready, your build pipeline will kick off. And for CloudHub 2.0 and Runtime Fabric, it's that asset will first be published to Exchange. Then your MUnit test will run and your API will be built and your API will be deployed to dev. One thing about this, though, is if your MUnit tests fail, it'll stop. It won't deploy to dev. It won't build. But say it did. Once it's in dev, you can do your end-to-end testing in the dev environment. Say you're still in the development stage and you've got some failed testing, and so you go back up and you review that code, change that code, whatever, and you complete that cycle until you're ready for UAT. Let's say you're ready for UAT. What you'll do then is you've got successful dev testing. What you'll do then is you'll come up here and you'll create a pull request. You'll create that pull request from your feature branch into your main branch. Once that's created, you can go through a more formal code review process. And in that, people can comment on different things if they need to. You can have those certain specified approvals approve your pull request, or whatever needs to be done before you are saying, hey, we are ready for that main branch we're ready for that feature branch to be pushed into the main branch and merged. But once that's said and done and it's complete and then it's approved, it'll kick off that build and it'll start to publish to Exchange for CloudHub 2.0 and Runtime Fabric. Then your MUnit test will run, your API will be built again, and your API will be deployed to dev. After that, your release is going to be created. Okay, and this is because it's on the main branch. So part of this is the idea is you are building once and deploying everywhere. Okay, so in your when you're still in your development stage, you're kind of building over and deploying to dev, right? But then once you're ready and you're ready to go to UAT and production, the idea is to build once and then deploy that exact same version build to your different environments. But once that release is created, it's going to pause. It's not going to go any further because I've got some pre-deployment approvals on there. So you can do your end-to-end testing. This also means that, say, your quality engineers just aren't ready yet, so it just kind of holds on to that until it is ready. Again, if those dev tests fail, you kind of go back to square one, you go over again. But if it is successful and quality engineers are ready to test, and you can get that approval, and then you can manually deploy to the QA environment. Once it's in there, you can do your user acceptance testing in QA. If there are any failed QA testing, again, you go back up to square one. But say everything's good, all the QA tests have been completed and they're successful, and the testers say, hey, we're good, we're ready to go to production. You get the green light go to be approved, and you can go to production. You approve that and you deploy to production. But again, the idea is that that version that you've built is that same version that you're deploying to all three environments, that you're not only building and testing, but you're testing in that exact same version build in dev, then in QA, then before we go to production. So building once, deploying everywhere. So with the setup, just a little rundown, there's about 6 to 7 steps. As you can see here, we'll create the build pipeline. We'll pull in the Azure Pipelines YAML and configure it. We'll configure and install the settings XML. We'll add the properties to the library. We'll add the new release pipeline, and then we'll configure the POM XML. And then for CloudHub 1.0 only, I'll show the Mule artifact JSON and what you would need to set up there. But without further ado, I will go ahead and build my pipeline. So here we've got our MuleSoft demo organization. Then we've got our MuleSoft demo project. And within that project is where I can have multiple repositories, pipelines, and what have you. And so I'm going to start by creating a build pipeline. My code is in Azure repos git. I'll be using the live Azure demo one. And I'm going to save it. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to save it. And I'm actually going to create a new branch for this commit so that I can have the Azure Pipelines YAML, because I'm actually going to edit this in my studio. Okay, but before I edit it in my studio, I did want to show what I'll be going through. So my configured Azure, my Azure Pipelines YAML will start with a trigger. And this trigger is going to allow the main branch to run when it's updated via the pull request completion. The second step here is just specifying my agent pool. For which is using the Ubuntu, which is the latest Microsoft hosted agent. And then here we have the variable groups, and that is something I'll show in a little bit as well. My variable groups are where my runtime properties are housed. And then here is my build trigger. So this is the condition. So it's saying if everything succeeded above, my predefined variable build.reason, if it's either individual CI or manual, you can continue. And so in today's, if I were doing the feature branch, I would do the manual just to go to dev. And if I'm ready to put that main branch into development and QA and production, I would do the pull request, and it would complete as an individual CI. All right, the next step is I'm going to download that settings XML. Settings XML, we'll show that in a little bit as well. It's going to be where all of my my connected app credentials are going to be, and my Mule repository credentials. For CloudHub 2.0 and Runtime Fabric only, I'm going to publish this artifact to Exchange. Okay, so that's really the only difference in this Azure Pipelines YAML, is that CloudHub 2.0 and RTF will have this Maven task to publish to Exchange. CloudHub 1.0 will not. After that, I will have another Maven task to run the immunit test. It'll build and deploy to the dev environment. And So for this step 8, I'm grabbing the artifact ID. And so the artifact ID, I've seen in past projects where so if the name and the repository and the API name are all different, it just throws everything off. And so I'm grabbing the artifact ID because that's the exact same name it's going to use in future parts. So this one specifically. So step 9. Step 9 is using predefined variables. So the agent.build directory, and it's pulling that artifact ID, which comes from here. So this is my live Azure pipeline demo. So my artifact ID is what it's going to pull, because it's going to pull the artifact ID and then my app version. And then this is going to be to publish the jar into a container named drop. And we'll see drop a lot because this is where I'm publishing those 2 artifacts, which is the second artifact, the POM XML. So I'm publishing my jar and I'm publishing my POM XML. But what I'm doing here in this PowerShell, we'll see this again in release, is that I'm grabbing that artifact ID directly from my POM XML so that I can just use it again, nice and smooth in this when it's publishing my jar artifact. Okay. So let me go ahead and do that. So what I'll do is I will need to pull my main branch first. And then I will need to pull in my feature branch so that I can get my newly added Azure pipelines YAML. Ooh, not that. Okay. So here I'll have my trigger. And today, like I said, today we will do the CloudHub 2.0 deployment. So that is here, which is going to require that publish to Exchange step. And then I will put in my tasks to publish my artifacts to the container named drop. All right, all is well there. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to build a release. Okay. But before I do that, I'm going to show you the settings XML. So I'm not actually going to do this. I'm going to show just this slide. For my settings XML, I'm using the connected app credentials in my Mule repository. I actually have 2 settings XML. My non-prod settings XML is for my lower environments. And then I've got a production one because those connected apps I have one connected app for the lower environments and then one for the production, just to protect the production environment just a little bit more. Once that is in, I will install it into the secure files of libraries, such as here. And then you would give each of those the pipeline permission. So when you're giving pipeline permissions, part of that is you've got your organization and then you've got your project. And so within that project are the different pipeline permissions. You can't grant access to pipelines outside of the MuleSoft demo project. Okay, this is only within the MuleSoft demo project. So say you want to protect your pipelines just a little bit more, your settings XML a little bit more, I can actually specify just the pipelines I want to use this one. But in my case today, I've just allowed no restrictions so that it can use any pipeline. But again, those are just very customizable options to tighten up security in that way so that if I have multiple settings XMLs that need to go certain places, it can only have access to certain pipelines. And then my variable groups, I'll put my variable groups in, and then my variable groups are where my runtime properties are. So for example, the default Mule properties. So these are my anypoint platform credentials, business group, and those kinds of things. For credentials that are secret or need to be hidden, you can input them and then lock them. And once they're locked, you can no longer see them again. You can't unlock them. The person that did them can no longer unlock them, and they are locked forever. If you need to edit or redo it, you would just have to paste in that entirely new value, cannot re-see that value. And again, you would also do the pipeline permission for each variable group as well here. All right, and then the next thing is going to be, I'm going to create a release. So here, so we did the build pipelines, and now we're going to do the release. And so you can do a new release pipeline, but I actually have a template here, which you can also create as well. And then I'm going to clone that. So to save a little time. All right, but I'll talk about through each step. So the first thing I'll do is I'll add my build artifact. And so this build artifact is the one that I created earlier. And so it's going to wait for the live Azure pipeline demo. I'll set my deployment trigger. And so this is going to say, hey, when do you want a release to be created? And so I want a release to be created for a continuous deployment. And so, but I don't want it to create for a feature branch. I only want the main branch. And so what this does is I can also exclude, right? I can exclude the feature branches. But in this case, I am saying, hey, I only want a release to be created when the main branch has gone through and built in pipelines and it has succeeded. If the feature branch has gone through and built in pipelines, I don't want it to create the release. And so that does it there. Okay. And then we have our stages, or your stages are your environment. And so you can have different triggers here. In my case, I'm doing manual for this, and I have a pre-deployment approval of myself. You can also put multiple users or put a group together and do that as well. But for the triggers, you could also do after release or after a certain stage is completed. But for double protection purposes, I'm doing manual and a pre-deployment approval, so that it just has that extra step of having to click, okay, deploy. So the QA environment. So I did want to talk about the agent job. Your agent job, you've got your Azure pipelines for your Azure agent pool. And then I've got my agent specification here. And there are 3 tasks. The first task is we're downloading that settings file again. So I'll download the non-prod settings XML for my QA environment. Again, that PowerShell script that we saw earlier, setting that artifact ID. This artifact ID will be used again in my Maven task. So here, I'm using those predefined variables again, system.default working directory, and the build.definition name. So this actually comes directly from the build definition name here. My drop container, which was the name of those artifacts that were published, and my POM, which, if you remember earlier, I published them here. And then my Maven task. And so, like I said, I'll be using the CloudHub 2.0. And so what this does is this pulls in my POM XML. I'm going to deploy to the QA environment. And I'm also pulling in that settings XML file here. So here's the Mule artifact, which will be the jar. I only want to deploy the jar. And so it uses that artifact ID again. I'm going to skip the test, but I'm going to deploy to the QA environment. And so these are the rest of my runtime properties that can be seen in the library of my variable groups. If this was a new one, I could clone this stage if I've set it up, but I already have it set up here because it's a template. So here we've got we're downloading now the prod settings XML instead of the non-prod because it's the prod environment. Again, with this artifact ID and then Mule deploy. So the options here are going to be different just because my connected app credentials are going to use prod, my prod connected app instead of my non-prod. So I adjusted that here, but everything else is the same. For variables, so variable groups, we have the default Mule properties here. So what this does is this says all of these can be accessible to the release, so accessible to all the different stages. But I want my QA Mule properties to only be accessible in my QA environment stage. And so that's what I'm doing here, as well as my production ones. I want my prod Mule properties to only be accessible in the production environment here. Okay, I'll save this. And the next thing we'll talk about is the POM XML. So I'll set this up really quick so I can kick it off because it does take a while for it to run sometimes. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll add the properties in the Mule Maven plugin configuration. Then we'll add in the munit. And so what munit does is because I'm running munit tests, this says I want coverage to run. If I want it to fail, I want the build to fail if munit tests fail. And then I also want an application coverage of 80%. Now you could also increase this to 90%, 100%, whatever the requirement, whatever you require. And then for CloudHub 2.0 and Runtime Fabric, I'm going to put in that distribution distribution management to her anypoint exchange so that it can publish to Exchange. So here in my live Azure pipelines one, I'm going to go ahead and set up my configuration. So these are my CloudHub 2 configurations. This is my M unit, which I'll just uncomment here. We saw that earlier, as well as my distribution management. Okay. All right, I'll save that. And I'm actually going to go ahead and commit and push this. Push to pipeline, or whatever my commit message is, which is Azure pipelines YAML and edit on XML. Okay. Saving and pushing. So what I'll do is I'm actually going to go ahead and kick this off so that it can go ahead and run and I can continue talking and looking at those differences. And so what I'll do here, I'll create that pipeline demo. This is a commit message. I'm doing my feature branch into my main, create it. And from here, I can, this is where my code review. I can also add a required or an optional viewer. So if there's a required viewer, that means that person has to approve it. I'm going to go ahead and approve and complete this though. You can also delete that source branch. So I'll just do that here. Again, comments must be resolved. This is where I could have, other developers could put comments in as they're reviewing. There's so many different ways. So you can add those reviewers or whatever. But it's going to go ahead and kick off my pipeline because I completed that pull request into the main branch. What it did initially is it checked that condition. So it checked and said, hey, the trigger says main. Then it said the condition was individual CI, which we see here was the reason. So if the reason is CI, so let's see. So like I said here in the condition, if everything above succeeded, and then the build reason was individual CI or manual, and this one was individual CI, and it had the trigger here as main branch, and so because of that, it kicked off. These are our logs. This is where it's going to publish to Exchange. Okay. These are those different steps. So it's first going to publish to Exchange, then going to run those unit tests and build and deploy to the dev environment, and grab that artifact ID and then publish your jar and your POM. While that is running, okay, let's see, it's 9:37. Yep, and this already alerted me that the Maven build clean dev deploy is started running. So while that's deploying, I did want to show the property differences between the three different deployment targets. So we have CloudHub 1.0. It uses region, workers, worker type, and your properties. CloudHub 2.0 and Runtime Fabric are very similar. We have target, MC provider, replicas, vCores, and in CloudHub 2.0 and Runtime Fabric, if you want to protect your properties in the settings of your Runtime Manager properties, you're going to do that here in the POM XML, and you're going to use the tag secure properties, and that's where all the properties you want hidden are going to be. So my anypoint platform credentials, and then my key store, key pass, and my password, those are secure properties that I don't want shown in Runtime Manager in the settings of properties. To hide and protect CloudHub 1.0, that's actually going to be done in Mule artifact JSON, which we'll get to in a sec. Let's check on this. All right, so it published to Exchange. Okay, this right here are the different options that we saw here in Azure Pipelines. For example, I wanted to skip those unit tests. I'm going to grab the organization ID because I needed that property. It gives the app version, API version, my app runtime, anypoint platform credentials. And if you see here, my anypoint platform credentials, which you remember were locked, you can't see them. So they're going to lock them here as well. You're not going to be able to see them anywhere because I've locked them in those variable groups earlier. And so it's locked here. And then because I have them in secure properties, it also locks them in a platform runtime manager as well. So these are the logs. And so it shows where it published that asset, it's complete, and my asset is successfully published to Exchange, which means it is ready to be deployed. This is also where the MUnit test happened. So it gives me an MUnit coverage report. These were my 3 MUnit tests that needed to be run. The application coverage I got was 100%. If you remember here, I needed at least 80% application coverage. And so if my application coverage dropped below that level, it would have stopped and it would have not continued on. Okay. So application coverage is 100% there, and it is still going. So at this point, it's starting deployment to my CloudHub US East one, which is my public target, or my public shared space for CloudHub 2.0. Okay. While that's running, I'll show you the Mule artifact JSON. So if I want to secure those properties in CloudHub 1.0 only, I'll do that in the Mule artifact JSON file, which is down here, I didn't have to do that for CloudHub 2.0 or Runtime Fabric, but that's where I would have done it for CloudHub 1.0. You'll put secure properties and you'll list out the properties that you don't want shown in Runtime Manager. And so you see here, my endpoint platform credentials were the ones that are locked, and so you can't see them here as well. That is where those are hidden. And then the ones for my CloudHub 2.0, I did them again in that POM XML. Okay. Alrighty, and so that is ready to go. And so I'm actually going to go ahead and hit releases. And while that's running, I'll talk a little bit more. So it has already created a release because, here, let me go ahead and deploy this. All right, so it's waiting in deployment. And so it's waiting for my approval. So if I go here, it's probably going to take a second. It's actually going to give me a Slack notification to approve or reject this QA environment deployment. So I'm going to approve it here. And yep, it's kicking off. And so what this was, if we go back, I kicked off my live Azure pipeline demo, and it deployed to dev. It built and deployed to dev. So it produced one artifact. That was my drop. That was my jar, and that was my POM XML. And it also 100% of my test passed. Okay, and because this was completely successful, it then created a release because that was on the main branch, which is what I had it triggered to. If you remember that, I had only the main branch to create a release if the build pipeline was successful, and it was. So here, that's what's happening here, and now you can also check the logs here. So now it's also now attempting to deploy to my QA environment. These are also the logs here. So this is the PowerShell one for grabbing that artifact ID, as well as my settings, downloading my settings XML. Let's check those. So I actually use what's called the sandbox environment for mine. This is what I'm calling dev. But here it is. This is the new one. All right. So this is what just kicked off. So it just successfully started 3 minutes ago, May 16th, 2023, 21, 9. So this is the live, this is just the one that deployed to dev, and now it should be deploying to the QA environment as well. Oh, and it's doing that right now. I had one already done, but it's going to reapply that there, and it's going to deploy to my QA environment. Something else I could do while So remember, like I said, once it's successfully deployed to the QA environment, I can hit deploy here to production, and it'll be waiting. So you could do this either in Slack once it pops up, or you can do it here. So for the sake of this one, I'll just go ahead and approve that. And so I'm going to approve it, but it's going to be waiting. It's going to wait for the QA environment to finish up and deploy, which it's doing now. Let's check those settings. So like I said, if those properties that I want hidden are in the secure properties aspect here, it's going to show that here. And it does. So my endpoint platform credentials, I don't want them shown. And so it says protected value. So live, it's running. It's up and running and ready to go. So soon this should say successful. And once that's successful, it's actually going to go ahead and kick off that production one because I went ahead and deployed it to that one as well. And if you see, so like I said earlier, we were talking about build once, deploy everywhere. And so this build version is 2023-05-17.1. And so what it means is this version is the exact same version that we built here in pipelines, that we built, we tested in dev, we ran in-unit test in, and then again, hypothetically, it's in QA environment, and it's that exact same build is now in the QA environment and tested. And then hypothetically, because all of those UAT tests passed, it's now tested in the production environment. And so it's going ahead and deploying to production. I'll switch over to that one. While I'm switching over to that, I did want to point out the deployment target setup differences. So there's not, if you followed along nicely, then you'll see that there's not really a whole lot. CloudHub 1.0 is the only one that you're going to hide properties in your Mule artifact JSON. CloudHub 2.0 and Runtime Fabric are very similar. So for them, you protect your properties in the POM XML. You have to publish to Exchange prior to deployment, and you must have distribution management in the POM XML. But the Runtime Fabric is going to use that Runtime Fabric agent. So those are the only differences as far as the setup differences for your CICD pipelines. Everything else was pretty reusable. And so this one is now running and applying. All right. Checking if it started. All right, and so earlier we did see where the QA environment did succeed, and it went ahead and gave me the approve reject here. It also told me that my deployment of the release 1 on staging QA environment has started, and then it was pending, and it should show success. Okay, so here's the succeed for my build. So this was the alert of that. And so say you have a channel of a bunch of folks that are your stakeholders, your testers, or whatever, and they all want to be kept in date of what's happening. So you can put them in a channel and they can get the play-by-play or almost live play of what's happening. All right. Let's see. All right, and it's up. So now my live Azure pipeline demo production is running in prod. And so this will soon check that it is live because that's what it was doing earlier. It said checking to see if it started. And it should soon. Because since this started, it'll kind of go back and all right, and done. All right, so now we have a succeeded to QA environment and we've succeeded into the production environment. So like I said earlier, one thing we can do is say this is our last successful deploy to production. We can retain this release indefinitely. And the point of that is because I'm retaining it indefinitely, I'm locking it. This means say for my next version release, if something goes wrong, I can immediately go back to this one, go to production, and redeploy that exact same build, because this is that same trusted build that we built earlier in pipelines. We did our in-unit test, we tested in QA environment, and that's the exact same version build that we'll put back into production if we need to roll back or something. All right, and that's about it for our demo. So here we've got questions. If you have any questions, feel free to connect or reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can use the QR code here. Again, my name is Catherine Wills, and that's where you can connect with me on LinkedIn. And then we also have these MuleSoft meetups for sharing on social, and then our meetup feedback as well. But other than that, thank you guys so much for watching. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out.